Shalom, shalom. Hello, everyone. Shalom לרחוק ולקרוב, to those who came from near and far. Welcome to the opening evening of the colloquium of the Literature Department, which is a very special event due to our guest, whom we'll hear about in a moment. My name is Ariel Linder. I'm the head of the department. I'd just like to briefly say thank you to all of our partners in this special event. So I'd like to thank the French Institute and Yael Baruch from the French Institute. This visit is thanks to the wonderful events that the French Institute is conducting tomorrow, the Proust Night. So our department, we sent over the invitation. You're very welcome to register. It's an amazing program, and I hope you enjoy it. So thank you very much to the French Institute and to the French Embassy. And a big thank you to the Institute of Advanced Studies, the Machon Lelimudim Mitqadmim, and Ayelet Ishman over there, for all of our help during the last few months while we were preparing this event. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the literature department, as well as Hagit and Chava, who are somewhere here, I hope, who helped facilitate more of the technical side. And I wish us all a very good and pleasant and interesting and perhaps comforting evening. So I'd like to pass the microphone now to Professor Iris Milner, who's organizing the whole colloquium. Iris,
good afternoon, everybody, dear students and colleagues, dear guests from outside the university, and of course, dear Professor Compagnon, whom we are very happy and privileged to host at this opening meeting of our yearly seminar of our department. I want to say just a few words in Hebrew to our students. Allow me please, לסטודנטים ולסטודנטיות, לתארים המתקדמים שלנו. אנחנו פותחים בזאת את הסמינר השנתי שלנו, שיהיו בו 5 מפגשים. כמובן שזה חלק מהתוכנית המרחיבת האופקים של החוג ודיון משותף. אנחנו מאוד שמחים שהגעתם ומקווים לראות אתכם במפגשים הבאים. So in preparation for today's meeting, I reread rather, about the religious wars in the 16th century France, to refresh my memory regarding the circumstances surrounding Michel de Montaigne, whose work will be discussed this afternoon. Reminded of this history of bloodshed, I could not help but be frustrated, as always, frustrated and anguished by what was, as in religious wars all over the world and across history, a terrible waste of countless lives and an immense suffering for so many. A shadow of a civil war is undoubtedly hanging, maybe doubtedly, I think undoubtedly, hanging over us here in Israel today. It is accompanied, indeed perhaps produced, by the general acceptance within Israeli society of, I dare to say, an apartheid regime in the West Bank, in operation for many years already, and worsening every day now. This acceptance is also reflected in the widespread containment of Israeli atrocities in Gaza, justified as an act of revenge, instead of sustained efforts to imagine forms of regional coexistence, despite the horrors experienced by Israeli society on October 7th. So thinking about your promise for this to be a comforting evening, I already ruined the party. It is precisely because we are constantly confronted with the rejection of the option of living together that we chose this issue as the theme of the Literature Department annual seminar. We regard literature as a space, an arena for reflecting on possibilities of possible alternatives such that may allow us to hope for an ethical existence in the presence of difference. In this spirit, we are especially grateful to Professor Compagnon for helping us think today through Montaigne about coexistence in times of internal violence. So I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Compagnon and Professor Michel Kahn from our department, who will introduce our lecturer, our guest, and moderate the discussion that will follow. Thank you and have a good evening.
Welcome everyone today, and thank you for attending the first meeting of the Literature Department seminar organized by my colleague Professor Iris Milner. It is a pleasure and a great honor to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Antoine Compagnon. Professor Antoine Compagnon is Professor Emeritus at the Collège de France, where he held the chair of Modern and Contemporary French Literature, History, Criticism, Theory between the years 2005-2021. He is Blanche W. Knopp Professor of French and Comparative Literature at Columbia University in New York since 1985, and he was elected to the most prestigious institution in France, the Académie Française, on February 2022, and we congratulate him for this remarkable achievement. He is the member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and the Academia Europaea, corresponding member of the British Academy and the Japan Academy, honorary doctorate from King's College London, from the University of Liège, the University of Bucharest, the University of the West, and last but not least, the University of Tel Aviv. He is the author of a very large list of books, too large to be enumerated here. A lot of them receive awards and prizes. His research involves three main areas: the Renaissance, 16th century France, the 19th and early 20th centuries, and theory of literature and history of criticism. He focuses on Montaigne in several books: La Seconde Main, the second-hand use, the work of quotation, published the first time at 1979, a very interesting book, not only on Montaigne, but also on literature theory and analysis of discourse. He wrote another book, Nous, Michel de Montaigne, Oui, Michel de Montaigne. A third book, Chat en poche, a cat in the pocket, Montaigne and the Allegory, and this small and very popular book who became a bestseller, A Summer with Montaigne, from which you have been requested to read a short chapter. On Proust, after editing Du côté de chez Swann and Sodome and Gomorrah, Antoine Compagnon published Proust entre deux siècles, Proust between two centuries, and lately he wrote a book which has been translated into English, Proust, A Jewish Way. Compagnon traces Proust's ties to the French Jewish community through his mother and the family of his mother. He explores how French Jewish read and responded to Proust's masterpiece In Search of Lost Time during the 1920s and 1930s decades. Among his important books on literary theory and the history of literary studies, I would like to mention just one book, Le démon de la théorie, littérature et sens commun, published in 1998 and translated to, in English, The Demon of Theory, Literature and Common Sense, a book that has been reedited many times, where Antoine Compagnon proposes an engaging introduction to contemporary debates in literary theories. The book is organized around few very important issues: literariness, the authorship, the word, the reader, style, history, and values. What makes a work literature? Does fiction imitate reality, and in which degrees it imitates reality? Is the reader present in the text? What about the death of the author? What constitutes style? Is the context in which a work is written important to understand the work, to interpret it? And of course, are literary values universal? Several recent works by our guest extend this line of thinking and enrich it by considering, of course, the new technologies that are transforming our lives, the lives of researchers, the life of readers, and the life of the novelists and the authors. Only in 2024, Antoine Compagnon published 2 books on this topic, which with intriguing titles, La littérature ça paie, Literature is worthwhile, and La littérature pourquoi faire? La littérature for what sake, for what purpose? His last book is devoted to his intellectual mentor, Roland Barthes, Déshonorer le contrat, Roland Barthes et la commande, which has been published this year in 25. And in this book, he shows how Barthes navigated between request to write and to give lectures, and his own ways of responding to this request. Roland Barthes needed to get commands, solicitations, but he managed it in his own way. And this is not the first book that Antoine Compagnon writes on Barthes, a memoir on his friendship with Roland Barthes, titled L'âge des lettres, the years of the literature. Maybe I should translate it like this in English. It's published in 2015. And about the friendship and the connections that you had with Roland Barthes, you know, our students know very well Roland Barthes. So I remember an episode, something that you told in one of your lectures connected to a gift that you got from Roland Barthes. You said that you wrote your first books with an electric typewriter that you got as a gift from Roland Barthes because he couldn't manage with his electric typewriter. It was too speedy for him. And then you got it, and you wrote your first book with that. And I think it's a very touching story, very nice story, symbolizing the love for literature and symbolizing also the transmission from generation to generation. So thank you for being here. And today you will talk about speech belongs half to the speaker, half to the listener, Montaigne, and the question of civil war. You will speak about 45 minutes, maybe you can a little bit more, and then we will have some 30 minutes for debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me again. I've spoken in this university many times. The last time was in May 23 when I received this doctorate honoris causa from the university, but there were many other occasions. And I haven't been here since May 23. So I will discuss coexistence and Montaigne and this idea of coexistence. When I received word of your seminar, the topic of the seminar, I was surprised and disconcerted at first. Coexistence. Coexistence of whom, with whom, of what, with what? Do you want to deal with the concept of coexistence, the idea of coexistence, or the reality, the actuality of coexistence? The thing itself. What is coexistence? Firstly, I think we should remember that coexistence has to do with time, not space. The concept of coexistence originally means concomitant existence, simultaneity, coincidence versus succession. coexistence is simultaneity. From medieval Latin, coexistentia, it originally concerns the Christian dogma of the Trinity, the coexistence of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, who share one divine essence and who are co-equal, co-eternal, and coexistent. Of course, some heresies in the history of Christianity contested the notion of coexistence. But we might start by remembering that the term and the notion comes from Christian theology and medieval Latin. In French, the first occurrence of coexistence is in 1554, and it describes the coexistence of the three divine personas. The word is used frequently by Bossuet and becomes common in the 17th century. In English, in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, the first attestation is 1646, and it's always in the sense of simultaneity. In the 19th century, for instance, in Thomas de Quincey, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, in the relation to each other of succession and not of coexistence. So the notion has to do with time, not space, and it has to do with gods and not human beings. Human beings, I would say, never coexist. Never coexist in the temporal sense. We all live in different times. I am a disciple of the philosopher Siegfried Kracauer, who insisted on the non-simultaneity of contemporaries. We are contemporaries in this room, but we are not simultaneous. We don't live in the same time. Kracauer criticized the notion of zeitgeist, the idea of the historical unity of any given period, and conceived the present, the instant, as an assemblage of heterogeneous instants, autonomous and incoherent events, situated on different temporal trajectories, each trajectory submitted to its specific law in its specific history. We are together in this room, but we do not coexist. We are not contemporaries in the sense of Kracauer. Age, sex, identity, personal history, beliefs, we do not live the same present. Apart from the angels who communicate without language, with an instant knowledge of the volition of the other, we do not coexist. We are not transparent to one another. In fact, the term is extremely rare in a spatial sense until very late. From theology and Christianity, it moved to philosophy in the 18th century. We will find it in Condillac to describe sensualism in the 18th century. Then we find it in Maine de Biran In the 19th century, psychologists used the word coexistence. Auguste Comte, John Stuart Mill, always in a temporal sense. Tarde, Bergson, sociology uses it. In fact, it's always the coexistence of sensation, the coexistence of perceptions that is the object of the notion of coexistence. I observed that it is one of the key concepts of Merleau-Ponty in the phenomenology of perception. 41 occurrences of coexistence in Merleau-Ponty, which is a record. It's a key concept here, and it's mainly to describe the way different sense perceptions coexist. So there are almost no attestation of this term in a spatial sense before the end of World War II. If you check on Ngram Viewer, the Google statistical tool, you see a spike of coexistence starting in 1945, and then it almost disappeared in 1989. It coincides, it's a synonym of the Cold War, coexistence. The word is linked to the Cold War, and there it emerges outside of philosophy and after theology and philosophy. One speaks of coexistence in the second part of the 20th century, and this is when the term took off, designating an explicit or tacit agreement allowing states or blocks of states to maintain peaceful relations despite opposing economic, political, ideological, and social structures and potential sources of conflict. In fact, the key adjective, an epithet, like an epithet in Homer, is peaceful coexistence, which is synonym with Cold War, as I said. One could find a few instances of the word before the Cold War. During the war, the war in the Balkans in the late 19th century, the word peaceful coexistence appears. The expression peaceful coexistence appears there, and it describes a possible resolution of conflicts in the Balkans at the time of the war of Serbia and Montenegro. We have seen other flurries of the same war after Yugoslavia disappeared. Peaceful coexistence after the war of Serbia and Montenegro against the Ottoman Empire in 1876, demanding for the insurgent provinces, and I quote, the establishment of institutions that allow for the peaceful coexistence of population of diverse races and different religions. So we have in 1876 a definition which concerns us directly. Thus, the term and the notion in its spatial, as opposed to the temporal sense, originates in the Ottoman Empire before World War I, is almost never used between the first part of the 20th century and then proliferates after 1945, from 1945 to 1989. And this coexistence is mostly qualified as peaceful, sometimes as competitive coexistence between the West and the USSR. Now, I assume you do not plan to discuss the Holy Trinity, the first sense of the coexistence. nor the Cold War, which are the most common uses of the expression, or the Balkan Wars in the 19th century. The two main contexts in which the expression was used and made into a principle, a dogma. The future was predicated on the idea of coexistence, divine coexistence, the Trinity, peaceful and competitive coexistence, the Cold War. In this second meaning of coexistence, having less to do with time than space, the antonym of coexistence, instead of succession, is, I would say, alliance, coalescence, concord, harmony, union. These are the opposite of coexistence. Coexistence in the political, sociological versus theological, metaphysical sense, in other contexts than the Cold War, emerged quite late in the 20th century as a synonym of any war that could be cooled, I would say. Any war that could be cooled. That is, coexistence is war. Is war, competition, not peace, but suspension of hostilities, ceasefire, armistice. In French, we have this expression, le silence des armes. Difficult to translate in English. It's just the absence of gunfire. Coexistence is the absence of gunfire. Hence, in a much looser sense, coexistence simply refers to living together. In Spanish, the expression convivencia is not recent, not as recent as coexistence in how we use it nowadays. Convivencia denotes the fact that communities that are hostile can live together side by side without mingling, but without fighting, without destroying each other, as the USA and the USSR could have done during the Cold War if they had not understood it as peaceful and competitive coexistence. In French, more recently, we have used the expression, which is an exact translation of convivencia, le vivre ensemble, the concept of the vivre ensemble, which has become a cliché, as if all the problems that the nation faces result from a failure of the vivre ensemble, elevated to, I would call it, a second best value, vivre ensemble. Vivre ensemble, it's a second best principle, precisely as opposed to a national feeling of belonging. It's just vivre ensemble. In lieu of understanding the nation as a community, the vivre ensemble has become a pseudo-concept in the absence of a sufficient social cohesion, commonality, or even common decency. And when assimilation, later integration, or even acculturation no longer operate, communities are content to live side by side without fighting. You know the motto of the French Republic, liberté and égalité, from the French Revolution, fraternité, added in 1848, laïcité, added in 1905, even though laïcité was not used in 1905. It's an anachronism to add laïcité to the... So, well, all of these notions seem to be obsolete or inefficient, and they are replaced by a sort of basic no-frills vivre ensemble, coexisting side by side as peacefully possible. We often also have the notion of civilité. Civilité. It's more or less the common decency. We speak so much about the vivre ensemble because we are no longer sure what we are doing together. But you may think this is a problem for the rich, the privileged, in Paris or in New York. I just came back last week from New York, and of course, there's also an issue of civility and convivencia, of vivre ensemble in communities. In any case, the concept of coexistence has been reduced to convivencia among communities, which was an idealized view of Muslims, Christians, and Jews living together more or less peacefully in medieval Spain, according to the historian Amerigo Castro, who introduced the... In Paris, when I arrived in Paris last Wednesday, it coincided with the celebration of the 100 years of the law of separation of church and state in 1905. So I opened the radio and heard the word laïcité, which, as I said, didn't exist in 1905. It did not, it's an invention of the 1980s, the word laïcité, a word which is, of course, untranslatable. It's a Franco-French concept. And I also heard all along, I opened the radio arriving in Paris, and I heard commentators of the celebration of the law of separation of church and state who said it's a law about the coexistence of liberties. Coexistence of liberties. This is the present to the 2025 definition of the law is coexistence of liberties. Of course, this is totally absent in the context and the circumstances of the law. If a word could have been used, it would have been a law of concord. Heart concord is not the same as coexistence, having the same heart, concord. So the idea of coexistence in 1905 is totally inaccurate. But this is the present definition. Separation of church and state is a coexistence of liberties after more than a century of war between the two France. Since 1789 to 1905, there is a long war between the two France, the Catholic France and the other France, meaning what Maurras called the anti-France, the anti-France. The two France, for Maurras, one was the anti-France, which for Maurras included the Protestants, the Jews, and the Freemasons, being what we would call nowadays laïcité, the lay France, the secular France. So the separation of church and state declared an end to a war that had been going on between a Catholic France and an anti-clerical France since the Revolution. Coexistence presupposes disagreement, conflict, albeit muted. I was wondering whether we should not think of coexistence in terms of a negative coexistence and a positive coexistence, as Isaiah Berlin discussed liberty. Positive, negative liberty, freedom from coercion, and positive liberty, freedom to act as one wills. Now, a couple of years ago, I foolishly accepted to go to Baghdad and give lectures at the universities of Baghdad and Najaf in Iraq, because I thought I had come too often to Tel Aviv, and I should balance my visits to Tel Aviv with visits to Iraq or other places. Yesterday, when I had to go through security at El Al, and they asked me if I had been to Lebanon, and I said yes many times, because I don't want to go only to Tel Aviv. And have you been to Cairo? And I said yes. Have you been to Tunis? And I said yes. So this was endless. And then I said, have you been to Iraq? And I said yes. Have you been to Iran? Yes, of course. Have you been to Afghanistan? And I said yes. So it took a while to go through the security, but this is, I would say, my Montaigne side. So when I went to Baghdad and Najaf, I was wondering what could I tell the students at the University of Baghdad and the University of Najaf. And I thought that a good idea would be to discuss Montaigne and the Civil War, to make the detour through another century, another period, and to take a lesson from what Montaigne has to say. Of course, he doesn't use the notion, the concept, the word coexistence. Montaigne, as I said before 1945, almost nobody does, except Bossuet. What Montaigne has to say about coexistence in what I would call a zero-sum game. If I win, you lose. If you lose, I win. This is more or less. Of course, in the Cold War, we all lose. Montaigne experienced civil war all through his adult life, the wars of religion. Every night, going to bed, Montaigne did not know if he would wake up alive the next morning. Civil wars are worse than foreign wars. This is what Montaigne declares in the essay. A civil war has this with it, worse than other wars have, to make us stand sentinels in our own houses. It's a grievous extremity for a man to be jostled even in his own house and domestic repose. The country, and he means the region, the southwest of France, the country where I live is always the first in arms and the last that lays them down, and where there is never an absolute peace. So we have no idea, Montaigne has no idea of what the supreme good is. But he is very well aware of what the supreme evil is, and the supreme evil is civil war. That is a war where your friend becomes an enemy the next day, where your brother becomes your murderer the next day. And Montaigne had numerous brothers, and the family was split between Catholics and Protestants. So when he discusses the evil of civil war, this is something he experienced in his family. So I thought it always important to return to those religious wars of the 16th century. When I spoke in Baghdad to those students, of course, they had the idea that Europe or France or Paris was something like the Garden of Eden, as happy as God in France, we used to say. And I was telling them that French people killed each other, ate the hearts, the livers of their fellow citizens, although they were not yet citizens, but subjects of the king, because they didn't share the same beliefs. Montaigne asked, how can they kill each other about the meaning of one syllable, the Latin syllable hoc, in the sacrament of the Eucharist? Hoc est enim corpus meum, hoc est enim calix sanguinis mei. They killed each other because some of them thought the Eucharist was the body and the blood of Christ, and the others only a symbol. Hoc, meaning of one syllable. There's a very interesting testimony on French cannibalism of the 16th century, very famous, by Jean de Léry, who is, according to Lévi-Strauss, the founder of ethnology, who experienced anthropophagy both in Brazil and in France, with the Tupinamba in Rio de Janeiro, the cannibals of Montaigne, and also in Sancerre, under the siege of Sancerre, Protestant city, and the Catholic siege. And they had to eat each other in order to survive. So this is what Jean de Léry describes, and this is the source of Montaigne in the essay, the chapter on cannibals, where Montaigne has this lesson of relativism. We are all barbarians. We are all barbarians. And this is what Jean de Léry says. If we want to get to the brutal act of actually chewing and eating human flesh, haven't there been instances in these regions, even among those who bear the title of Christians, who, not content with having cruelly killed their enemies, could only satisfy their courage by eating their livers and hearts? I refer to history. And without going any further, what about France? I am French, and I'm sorry to say so, during the bloody tragedy that began in Paris on August 24, 1572, the Saint Bartholomew, where Catholics killed Protestants. I do not accuse those who are not responsible. Among other horrible acts, to recount, which were perpetrated throughout the kingdom at that time, was not the fat of human bodies publicly sold to the highest and final bidder, were not the livers, hearts, and other body parts of some eaten by the furious murderers whose horrors even hell recognizes. One need not go so far as America, Brazil, to see such monstrous and prodigious things. Montaigne also witnessed this sort of behavior in the southwest of France, feared for his life, survived, he affirms in a chapter of the Essays, thanks to his good faith, I would say. The crucial value for Montaigne is the value of fides, the Roman Latin fides, which means trustworthiness, reliability. The word has changed. Fides in Latin and still in Montaigne designates the person who can be trusted. God can be trusted. So God is the faithful. We are not the faithful. God is the faithful. Good faith. And Montaigne says, I have a favorable aspect, both in form and in the interpretation. And he narrates, this is in chapter 312 of the Essays on Physiognomy, episodes of traps, ambushes. For instance, a fake ally enters his house, his compound, so he welcomes the person, and then the person reveals himself to be an enemy. And Montaigne has been too trustful. And he says this, he saw himself, this false friend, master of his enterprise, and nothing now remained but its execution. He had since several times said, for he was not ashamed to tell the story himself, that my countenance and frankness had snatched the treachery out of his hands. My frankness snatched the treachery out of his hands. He again mounted his horse, his followers who had their eyes intent upon him to see when he would give the signal, being very much astonished to find him come away and leave his prey behind him. So the enemy is stopped by the movement of good faith, fides, the Latin fides. Then on his way to Paris, with the Essays, which he's bringing to Paris, he is robbed on the road. And the robber's second event let him go. And he says, the true cause of so sudden a change and of this reconsideration without any apparent impulse and so miraculous a repentance in such a time, in a planned and deliberate enterprise, and become just by usage, for at the first dash I plainly confessed to them of what party I was. See, Montaigne doesn't hide in the face of enemies on the other side of which party he is. Truly, I do not yet rightly understand. The most prominent amongst them, who pulled off his visor and told me his name, repeatedly told me at the time, over and over again, that I owed my deliverance to my countenance and the liberty and boldness of my speech. So this is the fides, which implies a sort of reciprocity, frankness, openness, outrightness. Fides in the sense not of I believe you, but you can trust me. This is what fides means. You can trust me. It's symbolized in Rome by a handshake that we still use. The origin is the victor and the vanquished. From the victor to the vanquished, saying, you can trust me. I will not kill you. This is what it means, a handshake. So, frankness, let's say, fides, is not 100% safe. It's not 100% insurance coverage, but it is a bet on reciprocity. Montaigne, I think this is the quotation I gave in French, la parole est moitié à celui qui parle, moitié à celui qui l'écoute. This is the title I gave here. Speaking is half that of the one who speaks and half that of the one who listens. So this is why we don't coexist, as I said at the beginning. There's no coincidence. And even more to the point, this is an even better quotation, which I thought afterwards. Montaigne says, un parler ouvert ouvre un autre parler et le tire hors, comme fait le vin et l'amour. Open speech opens up further their speech and draws it out, just as wine and love do. And of course, the crucial word here is un parler ouvert, open, overt versus covert. The main opposition in Montaigne is ouvert, couvert. Couvert is dissimulation, of course. This is a Montaigne, I would say, wager in adversity, civil war, ambushes, and it paid. The world is in constant motion, but one must be truthful. That is, faithful to one's word. Wars of religion, of course, taught Montaigne a lesson of skepticism. I mentioned the word hoc earlier. Skepticism about all opinions and beliefs. He fights all forms of dogmaticism and fanaticism in the Apology, but in many chapters of the essay. He is acutely aware of the danger created by those who have certainties, who think they hold the truth. His doubt, lack of philosophical and theological certainties led him to an attitude of humility, balance, appeasement. He is always wary of universal pronouncements. For instance, he writes in the chapter on conference, if they judge in universal wordings, this is good, that is not, and that they happen to be in the right, see it be not fortune that hits up for them, let them a little circumscribe and limit their judgment. These universal judgments that I see so common signify nothing. These are men who salute a whole people in a crowd together. They who have a real acquaintance take notice and salute them one by one. We have to take each of you one by one, never as a universal. Before the age of the crowd, Montaigne is attentive. Of course, Montaigne never uses the term individual, which is a much later invention. but we could say that there is a sort of introduction of an idea of the individual, the modern individual. Skepticism, of course, leads to moderation or even tolerance. But here we should be careful before deciding that Montaigne was tolerant. Certainly not in the modern sense of liberty, which could not be present in a mind like that of Montaigne. It will only appear in the 18th century. There's a chapter in the essays called On Moderation, and Montaigne clearly condemns both Protestant excesses, iconoclasm, and Catholic residual paganism, pilgrimages, the cult of the saints, perhaps even the Mass and the Eucharist. Montaigne is a moderate, and there's a famous chapter called, in the essay, entitled De ménager sa volonté, of managing the will, which is about Montaigne's experience as the mayor of Bordeaux during the Wars of Religion at one of the most difficult times. Montaigne is an exemplar of moderation and tolerance, but let's be careful. Again, tolerance, there can be negative tolerance and positive tolerance. Montaigne we could say that Montaigne is an apostle of what we call coexistence. When my will, he says, leads me to join a party, because one has to be committed, because one has to join a party. When my will leads me to join a party, it is not with such a violent obligation that my understanding becomes tainted. So I will commit myself to one side, but not without understanding the other side. Amidst the present turmoil of this state, my self-interest has not caused me to overlook either the praiseworthy qualities in our adversaries or those that are reprehensible in those I have followed. So at the same time, he will acknowledge the qualities of his adversaries, meaning the Protestants, because he chose the Catholic side, and what is reprehensible on his side. And this is what qualified him to be a negotiator between the Catholic king, Henry III, and Henri de Navarre, the future Henry IV. Montaigne, as a political negotiator, was not above the parties because he chose his side. He committed to one side, but open, moderate, or let's say tolerant, even though I qualified the term. Montaigne belongs to the group of those who were labeled in the 16th century les politiques. What does it mean? Les politiques were those who placed the nation above the two religions, Catholic or Protestant. The politique, and it is a movement that will gather momentum for centuries, and I would say ultimately lead to the separation of church and state. The separation of church and state in 1905 was made by the politique of the moment. That is, Jean Jaurès and Aristide Briand, who wanted to find a common ground, a concorde between the Catholics and the anti-clericals. So the politique has a very long history from the 16th century and the wars of religion to the religious wars of the 19th century. What were the options during Montaigne's lifetime, the solutions to the conflict between Catholics and Protestants after the schism of the 1520s. This is where I say that we should qualify Montaigne's tolerance. Uniformity was the goal. For an early modern, for a 16th century mind or mentality, it was impossible to conceive the non-coincidence between nation and religion. Some of you might have read Lucien Febvre's famous book on La religion de Rabelais, Rabelais' religion, demonstrating that atheism was not conceivable in the 16th century, even though that position is now, has been criticized rightly. But the non-uniformity of country, nation, and religion was not conceivable at the beginning of the 16th century. One nation, one religion, since the baptism of Clovis in 498. The king was called le roi très chrétien, the most Christian king. France was la fille aînée de l'Église, the eldest daughter of the church. And this, of course, was not questioned by the presence of Jews in France. It's when Protestants, when the Protestant schism took place, that the Protestant separatism that became an issue. And so the response was an oscillation between persecutions and tentative and failed reconciliations. Neither working, neither persecutions nor tentative reconciliations. Persecution started with François Ier in 1534, continued under Henry II until his death in 1559. Then there was an attempt in dialogue and reconciliation under Michel de l'Hôpital, the chancellor. Montaigne was close to Michel de l'Hôpital. Already the politics. Michel de l'Hôpital thought that there could be a Gallican consensus, a French consensus between Catholics and Protestants, meaning a concord, dissolving schism in a French peace. But of course it failed also. And the third option, persecution, reconciliation, the third option is limited toleration. This is why I say that it's not the true tolerance that we have in mind after the 18th century. Limited toleration of a Huguenot minority. Limited toleration of a minority, an attempt at coexistence. People could live in peace with different religious opinions. This is the position that is known as politique, a sort of pursuit of stability. But of course, it also failed. The war started in the 1860s and the 1870s, in the 1560s, 1570s, 1580s. And of course, we should remember that two successive kings were assassinated. Henry III in 1589 and Henry IV in 1610. Assassinating the king, we could say that it has become banal. But in a Catholic, under a Catholic mentality, this is crucial. In Montaigne's Journal de Voyage, his travel journey in 1580, when he goes to Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, he is curious about the coexistence of sects. We cannot say that this was the goal of his travel. in these countries, but his observation in Switzerland and Germany have mostly to do with how the different sects coexist. I will skip the quotations because I see that I should stop. But of course, you also probably remember that this is both in Verona and in Rome, that he is exceptionally curious about the Jewish rituals, going to the synagogue in Verona and being present for a ritual circumcision in Rome. Whereas, of course, he could have seen that often in Bordeaux, where there was an important Jewish community, and then he would become mayor of Bordeaux. So he was interested in his trips about the coexistence, the peaceful coexistence of people of different faiths living together in the same village, town, or city, which was a real issue when he became mayor of Bordeaux. His insistence of fides, openness, moderation, trustworthiness, as a key to coexistence. I will probably skip that, but of course, the anti-model of Montaigne all through this period is Machiavelli. Machiavelli present all through the essays as the model of covetousness, dissimulation, hypocrisy. So Montaigne is really the anti-Machiavellian in his view of things. The social fabric, the basis of the social fabric for Montaigne is trust, fides. He writes in On Profit and Honesty, which is the chapter against Machiavel, otherwise, step by step, if we don't respect fides, otherwise, step by step, we will come to overturn all the rights that a third party takes from our promises and oaths. Society is based on good faith, reliability. So remember that trust, the same from the Proto-Indo-European is tree, the oak, the solid tree. Now, two caveats.
We do want to allow 15 minutes.
Okay, in conclusion, two caveats. Let's not make anachronisms. As I said, Montaigne is not an 18th century philosopher, not even a precursor of a positive notion of toleration based on freedoms and rights. Freedom of faith. He is not a proto-liberal. He has no idea of individual rights in his plea for peaceful coexistence. He is a pragmatic, prudent, cautious man of the Renaissance. No theory of rights, but he defends a civic compromise based on vivre ensemble, I would say. Skepticism leads to this tolerance, let's say, as a second best. Tolerance is a second choice, is a prudential course of modus vivendi, coexistence, and not much else. And I ask you to read the chapter on liberty of conscience, because the conclusion means that Montaigne doesn't, in fact, believe in liberty of conscience. There is no liberty of conscience. Montaigne says at the end that Julian, the apostate, chose liberty of conscience, liberty of freedom of faith, as a device, as a plot to divide his enemies. So there is no belief in liberty of conscience. And then he says, the conclusion is terrible. In France, the king, for that not having been able to do what they would, they had made a show of being willing to do what they could. This is, so there's no positive view of liberty of conscience in Montaigne, of freedom of faith, I would say. Tolerance is the second best. And the second caveat I would introduce to conclude, coexistence cannot be only negative. That's why I introduced the idea of a negative and a positive coexistence. Negative coexistence is equal but separate. And I refer to the famous doctrine from the US Supreme Court, separate but equal in 1896, which was overturned by Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and which might be overturned soon, sooner or later. Recognizing that separate facilities were inherently unequal and violated the 14th Amendment promise of equality. What we cannot call apartheid coexistence. This is the meaning of what I call positive coexistence. Positive coexistence means what Montaigne introduces as cooperation and dialogue when he speaks of speaking, which is half from the one who speaks and half from the one who listens. Now, when I gave a sort of similar talk in Baghdad a couple of years ago about the first question was by a student was, how did the wars of religion end in France? And of course, when did the French stop killing each other? Well, the answer was not very optimistic and hopeful, because as I suggested, it took at least until 1905. They killed each other in the French Revolution. The Edit de Nantes was revoked by Louis XIV in 1685. Priests were massacred in September 1792. There were revolutions in 1830, 1848, 1871, etc. The law of separation seemed to resolve the issue and the problems of minorities in 1905, as I said, made by politique. So we might think that coexistence, what we call laïcité and coexistence of liberties, was successful. But the positive coexistence, what I call the positive coexistence of religious beliefs, proves to be no longer obvious in France today. As I said, beyond assimilation, integration, acculturation, the vivre ensemble is really a second best solution. And this is how I will conclude in favor of a more positive coexistence.
Thank you very much. Really, it was the greatest opening of the seminar that we could have wished. It was perfect, thinking again about and thinking about the signification of the word coexistence in such a way, and going back to Montaigne and going back all the history of the meaning of this word, and the word also fides, which is so important. Fides, trust. Yes. Which is so important. So really, I think that many among you have questions. So please, you can sit if you wish, or whatever. Should I use the phone, the microphone? Yeah. Yes. Do you have some questions? Who wants to begin? You can see. Maybe I will begin with a short question. So Montaigne, you handed your speak by saying that we should be careful not to forget that we are living another time, and at that time of Montaigne, it was impossible to conceive the state, the country of France, the state of France, as separated from the Christian religion, from the Catholic religion, actually. But in another way, Montaigne can teach us so much about today and about how to manage today. But still, maybe there is some small gap between the two assessment that you are saying. Like we have to be careful not to make any anachronism, yes. But we have also to be very careful to what Montaigne can teach us.
Yes.
So what should we do, actually?
Montaigne can teach us a lot, but I say there's a tendency to turn Montaigne into a sort of proto-liberal, proto-modernist. And of course, I do not agree totally with Lucien Febvre in his religion when he says that Lucien Febvre says that one cannot think outside of one's episteme, Foucauldian episteme. One cannot think. This is the old issue for the historians of ideas. How does the new occur? In a paradigm, we think in a paradigm. We are prisoners of an episteme. But things change. And this has always been a sort of problem for the historians of ideas. And so we have to read very carefully Montaigne to see when there are, or Rabelais, 16th century authors, where there are very, very small changes. There are like, they are not radical, but they introduce. And you see the notion of tolerance in Montaigne, the politique, the group of the politics in French in the 16th century, they want peace. So what they do without acknowledging is placing nation above religion. But it's not yet possible to think of a nation that is not uniform in terms of religious belief. So they adapt, they manage. And it's the same thing when I say that there's no real notion of liberty of conscience in Montaigne, even though there's a chapter called Liberty of Conscience, but in fact, it qualifies it so much. But still, the word is there, liberty of conscience. I say there is no individual in Montaigne. There's no positive sense of tolerance. But Montaigne said, when the witches are executed by the judges, Montaigne said, who is the most crazy? Is it the judge or the witch? So there is a sense that things are introduced little by little. There's an article by someone I respect and like a lot, a good friend also, Terence Cave from Oxford, called Trouble dans l'épistémologie. So Montaigne creates zones of trouble, troubling zones about freedom, about beliefs, about the self. There's no modern self in Montaigne, but when Montaigne writes of his friendship between him and la Boétie, parce que c'était lui, parce que c'était moi. We tend to see the emergence of the self. Montaigne will never use moi as a substantive, le moi. Le moi will appear in Pascal. But Pascal owes le moi to Montaigne. You see? Pascal uses le moi from Montaigne, transform everything that Montaigne says about moi into le moi. So Montaigne is troubling. There's a lot of, Montaigne should disturb us. Is disturbing. Is disturbing because he is not content with thinking in his episteme. Episteme, as Foucault would call it. His episteme doesn't allow him to describe what he wants to describe. So I would say that his notion of tolerance is negative, but what he says about the open and covertness goes further than the notion of negative tolerance.
Yeah, thank you so much. You mentioned I'm very interested in the opposition between Machiavelli and Montaigne, and so if you can elaborate a little bit more, because you say there is this this ideal, that trustworthiness against Machiavelli, which is all about, yeah. So what, I mean, but what happens if, like, as a mayor of Bordeaux, for instance, he must, face someone who is Machiavellist. Like today, what we do when we face Trump, for instance. So what would Montaigne do when he needs to maybe be more sophisticated, or cannot really be trustworthy with someone like that?
Montaigne's response is very easy. He says, there should be Machiavellians. The reason of state has been introduced. He accepts it, but he says, it's not for me. It's not for me. I will not do it. And he says that when one has to, this is the chapter De l'utile et de l'honnête, which is all about the response to Machiavel, book 3, chapter 1, crucial chapter. Of course, Machiavel is crucial in the 16th century. You should remember that the king mother is Catherine de Médicis. So the king mother and her the last Valois kids, everything is done by the prince is dedicated to Catherine de Médicis' father. So we are in a Machiavellian France. So Montaigne acknowledges the reality of the reason of state. But he says, when, let's say, a politician acts according to the reason of state and not to honestum, which is moral beauty, to private morals, he should be aware of the sacrifice that he's committing. And this is not for me. I will never sacrifice my private morality for the reason of state. But he is perfectly aware that this is necessary. It's not for him. And he says that he has used fides, which is good faith, to his profit, up to now. And she died in his bed. So.
Yes, Ariel.
Thank you so much. It's okay. That was fascinating. I would like to go back to the very basic notion of the trustworthiness and ask you, in your understanding of Montaigne, what are the mechanics of it? What are the mechanics? He's facing someone who wishes to rob him, yes. And then he is frank, and that in some way disarms his enemy. Yes. What is it that disarms his enemy? In the name of what or whom does this enemy suddenly change his mind? And I think it's an important question, specifically in the context of civil war, because supposedly the Protestant and the Catholic could suddenly realize they're both Christian, or they're both humans. Or
both humans.
Yeah. So the question is, how does Montaigne understand the workings of it?
He described it, as I said, like speaking openly let's say, engages the partner. This is why I call it positive coexistence as opposed to negative coexistence. It introduces a dialogue. And so the other, and in this chapter 312, he describes these two occasions where it saved his life. He says, yes, it's good faith. Good faith implies good faith, like wine and love. Now, I cannot say much more. I said it's a wager. It might not always work, but it worked for him in the occasions that he describes. It's trust. For Montaigne, trust, fides, is the social link, the essential social link. And it starts in this fragment of coexistence. As I said, angels don't need to speak. They know each other through the mind. But as we speak, there are always misunderstandings. So it's going beyond these misunderstandings.
Yes,
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. I loved your philological beginning, questioning the very idea of coexisting, showing that it started only in after World War II. I'm thinking of cohabitation because I'm trying to hold on to Professor Miller's optimism in shaping this seminar. We are hoping for coexistence, but cohabitation has two interesting meanings. First of all, it's a secular marriage, two people living together without being married. And there is a political cohabitation, for example, in France, when, two parties share power. So is that an earlier word in French? Does it offer a different picture?
Well, you're right. I hadn't thought of the emergence of that notion of cohabitation between a president from one party and an assembly from the other party. The word cohabitation as a variation on the convivencia in Spanish, on the vivre ensemble. Cohabitation, it seems to me, has a sort of institutional meaning. It's institutional cohabitation. When people share an apartment, there's a contract. Now in France, we have what's called the pax. The pax. I should have spoken of concubinage, of course. Concubinage transformed into pax and cohabitation. There's something that is contractual, while coexistence is not based. Well, that's why I'm troubled by the expression coexistence of liberties to describe the separation of church and state, which I heard multiple times last Wednesday when I arrived in Paris. I hadn't thought of it as coexistence of liberties because it's not the vocabulary of the separation. But now this is how it is understood. Coexistence of liberties. This is weak. This is very weak. Vivre ensemble, it's not much coexistence of liberties. And that's why I say it's like a second best option.
And to conclude, I'd say that here in Israel, we'll take the second best with two arms, because I don't believe we have any better opportunities. So I wish to thank you in the name of all of us for this beautiful amazing lecture that really opened our seminar for further discussions, and wish you a pleasant stay in Israel.
I would also remind to the students that we have a beautiful translation of the essays of Montaigne in Hebrew. The book number 1 and book number 2 in its integrality. Number 3, Aviva Barak didn't manage to translate the book 3, so maybe one of you can continue this beautiful project. But really, I recommend you to take these books and to read Montaigne. It is a good way to go to sleep in the night. Thank you very much.